Folks, I think we're going to go ahead and get started.
Hey, Jerry, haven't seen you.
Thank you all for joining
I
us
haven't
for
seen
today's
you in a while.
Brownbag Talk. It's brought out a good crowd. It's looking like the Kansas contingent of the Russian Historical Society. We're glad to see you all here today. I'm going to actually turn it over to Norman Saul to introduce our guest. Before I do, I want to embarrass him just a little bit by thanking him for his generosity, not only for providing for students to travel to conferences through the Norman Saul Travel Fund, but also enabling us to bring speakers here like today's guest. So, thank you, Norman.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome William Benton Whisenhunt to the University of Kansas. First time he's been here. He teaches at the College of DuPage in the Chicago area. He graduated from Cornell College in Iowa, his undergraduate work, and did his doctorate at the University of Illinois, Chicago, Circle campus. He published, I think it was his dissertation on the reforms of Michael Speransky, and several other things related to his topic today and Russian-American relations, which is what brought us together at conferences in the U.S. and Russia, where we've been on the same panel or same group, and will be again in Philadelphia next week, I guess. So, and we've been busy traveling. Obviously, I just returned from Spain and Portugal. Why there? Because I'd never seen it before.
That's reason. That's the best reason.
He also has published what will be a model for a project of ours. The book by Marguerite Harrison, Marooned in Moscow. I'll circulate this. This is a republication, and I'll get back to the other. Another work which I found particularly interesting because it's more in my area, early area of Russian-American relations, A Russian Paints America, which goes back to the beginning of the 19th century, and Pavel Svinin, who was attached to the Russian legation and traveled around a lot and painted it. Anyway, it's a very interesting book done by McGill, Queen's University Press. And then one thing that's really brought us together, and one reason he is here today to work on the project, is a collaboration effort, New Perspectives on Russian-American Relations, which came out 6 weeks ago, about. So it's new, and the program has a copy back here. I see displayed. This is 18 contributions, including one each by the two of us, and it was a job of editing. So we were just reflecting that it was almost exactly a year ago that this thing started. So that's not bad, getting it out within a year. 18 contributions, 6 of them from Russian scholars, 1 from a French scholar and 1 from an Italian scholar, both women, and the others were American contributions. I'll pass this around and you can see. But there were editing problems, and you can imagine, with different styles and things that had to deal with, and one had to be translated. Anyway, this is what we did. And the new project, which we're just about to embark on, involves the topic today, Albert Rhys Williams, and a presentation that I made at the earlier Brownbag this fall. And this is the republication of books by Americans who were in Russia during the revolution and published soon afterwards. So there were a bunch of them, at least 20 or more, that we are considering. Not that all of those will be done, but anyway, we're about ready to get started on that. So today, he was going to talk about Albert Rhys Williams, who had a long engagement with Russia from the time of the revolution when he was there and wrote about it, one of those who wrote about his experiences, and his life as a supporter of the Soviet system in many ways. Yeah.
Well, thank you all. Thanks for coming today. And I want to especially thank your Russian Center here and Bart Redford and especially Norman Saul for having me out to Kansas. I don't remember the last time I've been to Kansas, actually. I lived in Nebraska for a certain time in my life, but I don't remember being last time I was in Kansas. There's a little bit of a backstory to the origin of this project, of this study. I've gone through several different projects, as you can see here, and as you can see from the books he's passing around, I've jumped in time a little bit from doing early 19th century, early 20th century, and doing a dissertation on a totally different topic. And so a couple of years ago, I was sort of wandering, mentally wandering about where I was going to sort of do something next. And as Norman said, that we've had many conversations and conferences and things, and he actually suggested this in an email. He probably doesn't remember that. But he suggested, somebody should do a good biography of Albert Rhys Williams. And I've known of him like I've known of other people, but he's always been sort of a peripheral figure in some ways. And so when I started to look at him more closely, I started to get more and more intrigued by him. And so that he's sort of, in many ways, the origins of the project for me is sort of an offhand comment probably in his mind in an email that sort of got me hooked for the past almost 2 years now. So be careful what you write in emails, because people sometimes take you seriously and think you should do this. So the first problem I had with this subject was he'd written about 7 books, depends on how you count a pamphlet, but whatever, 7 books on the Soviet system. He had done his first book, actually was a short, kind of odd biography of Lenin, which I'll talk more about in a minute. The book that we would be using in our series to reprint is called Through the Russian Revolution, but he published in 1921, which was his account, like many others, of his experience inside of the Russian Revolution. But the problem I had with this project is I wasn't sure exactly where else there was information about him other than his published works. And he had published some things in magazines and in newspapers, and so the published record was pretty clear. And I kept wondering why there was no biography of him in English. There are some biographical treatments of him in Russian, but they're not terribly in depth. So I kept wondering why there wasn't anything further. So I began to look into his background, and this is part of the story. His background is interesting because he's from Ohio. He's from a Welsh immigrant family from Ohio, and his father decided to stop being a miner, which probably is a good decision, and be a minister, and sort of made this abrupt decision. And then not only did Albert and his 3 brothers all become ministers, but even their children all became ministers, which is very confusing because they also all have very similar names. They use the name Rhys, and that's how they pronounce it, is Rhys, over and over again. And so you kind of lose track of who these people are over time a little bit. But when you look at his background, I started to think, well, were there papers anywhere? Well, there's one book that actually is sort of intriguing, and it's actually a reprint of his Through the Revolution book, and it was put out in 1967. And in this introduction, there's a long introduction that's not. It's not a typical sort of scholarly introduction. It's a long introduction that's kind of wandering in a certain way by a man named Joshua Kunitz. And Joshua Kunitz had actually been contracted by Williams and his family late in Williams's life to basically write a biography of him with a Russian counterpart, writing a Russian biography at the same time. Well, that biography never came about. And what did come about was a reprinting of his Through the Revolution book with this long sort of wandering introduction. But in that introduction, that has no footnotes, it says over and over again, well, in Williams's diaries, in Williams's notebooks. I kept thinking, what diaries? What notebooks, right? So I started to trace back his past. And what I figured out was that he was a minister in a church in Boston for about 6 years, from 1908 to 1914, called Maverick Congregationalist Church. Then his only son will be the minister at that church for 40 years, from the 1960s until his retirement in the early 2000s. So I just simply went to the internet, looked up this church, and I emailed the current minister of that church, and I asked, does this family have any connection back to this church, or do you have papers, or any sort of things? He immediately put me in contact with Williams's daughter-in-law, who is still alive. She's in her 80s. And she said to me in emails back and forth, she said, oh, she said, all of his papers were taken years ago. And I said, where did they go? Obviously. And she said, the people at Columbia took them. So I know a librarian at Columbia. So when you look in the rare books and manuscript library, they don't come up. They're not there. So I didn't want to throw Columbia under the bus to the family. So I know a librarian at Columbia, and I said, I'm looking for these papers. And he said, no, we don't have them. And I said, okay. The family said, years ago, these papers exist there. He said, okay, wait a minute. And the next day he came back. He said, oh yeah, we have 17 boxes of stuff. So there it is. So what that means is that it was an unprocessed collection. It was a collection that had never been processed. So it was as it was given. I think probably in the early 1990s. So it's been there over 20 years. And so about a year ago, I went there and used it. And I'm the only person who's ever used it as far as I know, because it was really dusty and all falling apart. And in no order whatsoever. So every box had, something from 1899 and something from, 1952. So it was a mess in many ways. So there's a lot in there that is not in his published works that gives you gives me at least a different view of him in part of this project that I'm working on. I will say though that most of his papers, despite that sort of long path, most of his papers, though, were copied and given over in the 1970s, after his death, but before his wife died, to the Lenin Library in Moscow. So they have their own set of papers there, which seem to be almost a mimic of this collection at Columbia. Because when you look through the papers in Columbia, they're marked by his wife she would write it 2LL, Lenin Library. So they're copies in both places. Mm-hmm. And I've looked at the ones in the Lenin Library, and it looks remarkably similar to what I looked at in Columbia. I think there may be some small differences, but not an enormous amount. So who is this person, right? Well, he's best known, so his background is he was born in 1883 in Ohio, and as I said, his parents were Welsh miners, and they shifted away from that very quickly. Williams himself went to Marietta College, which is in Ohio, and then he, like his father and his brothers, he was sort of being pushed toward the ministry. And so in 1904, after he graduated from college, he went to Hartford Theological Seminary in Connecticut. And from there, he earned a one-year fellowship in Europe, part of the time in Germany, part of the time in England. And when he returned in 1908, he not only campaigned for Eugene V. Debs, but he also became the minister for the next 6 years of this Maverick Congregationalist Church, which was a fairly impoverished church, apparently, in a very poor part of Boston. And his life work is almost sort of determined in this early period of his life. Sort of outside of the Russian context completely, is that he worried about poverty more than anything else. It runs through all of his writing all the way till his death in 1962. And he worried about sort of inequality. And he became sort of enraptured with socialism from a very young age, well before his Russian experience. But he found being a minister quite boring. He found it tedious. He found it also, he wrote in his papers that when he decided to leave the ministry in 1914 and become a war correspondent in World War I, he has a biographical sketch where he says, reasons why I left the church. I think it was number 2 that said, tired of being good and respectable. So I guess he wanted to go off and do other things. I've not raised that with his daughter-in-law quite yet in the email conversations we've been having, but nonetheless, I didn't. But anyway, so he's kind of a curious figure. He does become, right away in World War I, in the fall of 1914, a war correspondent, and he comes back from that experience writing a book called In the Claws of the German Eagle, which was his first book. He published in 1917, so he was there in 14, he published this in 17, just before he took off to go to Russia during the Revolutionary period. In this photograph that was taken at the time, was one of the most famous at the time, or infamous, maybe is a better way to put it. It's a very unusual story that I'm still tracking down if it's actually true or not, but I think it is, where he was traveling both with German units as for a time, because he was an American, so he could sort of go back and forth, but most of the time he spent with Belgians. And this is apparently a staged photograph of an execution. So he was with the Belgian photographers, and they wanted to stage an execution. So the person being executed is him. This is not a real photo. Well, it's a real photograph. It's a stage. It's staged. And so they said I think they were drinking. Okay. They decided, hey, let's have this photograph of Belgian soldiers shooting somebody, executing somebody, and we'll just take this. And so the photographers came out and they shot it. But what happened to this photograph, though, is it became fuel for propaganda, because it got out away from the photographer who took it, and this became, during this period of World War I, used by Germans as propaganda against the Belgians for being horrible and executing civilians, because he's wearing civilian clothing. But Williams was known at the time for being very much involved in always wearing a long trench coat wherever he went. Wherever he went, he always wore a long trench coat, and all the photographs I found of him are similar to this. But nonetheless, so this is, before he even gets to Russia, there's some controversy about what he has done in his own journalism out there in the world. After he came back from World War I, he was involved in writing many of these stories, writing this book. But then when the first revolution, the February Revolution of 1917 took place, he was sort of, as he describes in his own paper, sort of bitten by the bug of revolution, and he had to go see it for himself, and so he was one of the first people to get permission to go. He tried to join the Route Mission to go to Russia, but he decided to back away from that. He didn't want to be part of a diplomatic mission, and so he went as a journalist again. He got credentials again to go as a journalist, and he arrives in early June of 1917. And he once there, he doesn't know any Russian whatsoever. He goes to Petrograd, doesn't know any Russian. Wandering around the streets of Petrograd, writes about this in his diary, wandering around the streets of Petrograd, not sure what he's even observing. But then he did a crash course, he says, in Russian language for about 2 months, and then declares in September of 1917 that he was proficient, which I thought was pretty good. That's faster than I did. So anyway, nonetheless. But he did of most journalists that you find at the time, and you see this in his papers as well, he writes actually a fair amount in Russian. His handwriting in both languages is terrible, which is unfortunate, but he does actually write a fair amount in Russian with people, so he does actually become somewhat proficient during his lifetime with Russian, which was unusual and different than other correspondents, because these are the people now where he becomes associated with John Reed, obviously, who's the most famous of these people, and his wife, Louise Bryant, and of course, and then Bessie Beatty was another person who was very much involved with, and these are all people referring to our project we're talking about, who would be involved in that project as well, their accounts of their time there. But none of them learned Russian very well. Bessie Beatty didn't know any Russian coming in, I don't think he knew any Russian going out. I think Reed and Bryant got a little bit better at it, but they both had trouble with it. But William seemed to be the one that really picked up on it the most. And he stayed the longest as well. He stayed well into the following year. And then would return several different times. He got to know also Alexander Gutenberg, as well as Raymond Robbins. He actually became a lifelong friend with Raymond Robbins until Robbins' death in the 1950s. He met Lenin on at least 8 occasions, and part of this biography that he wrote is sort of a biographical treatment with some other parts to it. Might be the first biographical treatment of Lenin in English, as far as I can determine. I'm not sure if there's an earlier one. This was published in 1919. You might know, some of you, more than I would. I haven't found an earlier treatment of Lenin in English, at least, up to that point. It's not terribly in depth, but it is interesting to sort of read his impression of Lenin at the time. When the revolution comes, he is involved with Reed and others in distributing pamphlets and being almost a part of the revolution itself. In his writing, he is clearly giddy with this. He loves this. He thinks this is the greatest thing he's ever seen in his life. He is enthralled with this to such an extent that I think his writing maybe even betrays him a little bit, but nonetheless, he's just overwhelmed by the experience, and it's very obvious. And he wasn't a young man, if you think about it. He was in his 30s, about 34 years old, so he's kind of an interesting figure in that sort of way, that he wasn't someone who was terribly young, but he was somebody who really thought this was the greatest thing he'd ever done. By the spring of 1918, when the revolution's over, he's stayed on. Beatty and Bryant and Reed have all left, but roughly by that time. And he stays on, and he basically gets a job from Lenin, sort of indirectly, to go back to America and open up what's known as the Soviet Information Service. And so there is an American information service in Russia still at the time, and so they thought as a nice counter that it'd be useful to have a Soviet information service in the United States, which of course Americans viewed, the Wilson administration viewed almost immediately as spies and propaganda, which probably was. It never opened up and never did anything. So he decides to leave, finally by the early summer of 1918. He'd been there a year, but it took him another 4 months to get out of the country because he decided to not go back through Europe. It was too difficult to go through Europe, so he went across Siberia instead. And so in his writings, yes, but in his writings, going back the other direction, in 1918, he has, as it's noted many places, even though I've never seen the letters myself, because I don't think they exist any longer, he had 2 letters signed by Lenin that was supposed to give him sort of free passage all the way to Vladivostok, which that's a long way, by the way. Anyway. He travels. It takes him quite a while to get to Vladivostok. Once he gets there about the time that the Americans are landing troops in Vladivostok, and so his path out of Vladivostok is blocked. He waits around for a while, he consults with Bolsheviks out there, but then ultimately he has to go to China to get out of by land. And when he gets to China, he runs out of money. So he has no money to get passage back home. And so he has to send a telegram to Upton Sinclair, who apparently was a friend of his at the time. And Upton Sinclair at first said, he didn't say no. He said, in the letter, he said, do you really need this or something like this? And he said, yes, I guess I'm stuck in China. I really need to come home. So he got passage on a ship, and he ends up in Hawaii. In Hawaii, he has several boxes, as the story goes, he has several boxes of materials he'd been gathering, and even written a first draft of his book through the Russian Revolution. So you might ask, well, if he's leaving the country in 1918, why was his book published then in 1921? And in between that, he wrote a biography of Lenin. And it's because the Naval Intelligence Services in Hawaii confiscated all of his material, took everything away from him there, sent him on to San Francisco, and then said, and so he arrived in San Francisco in September of 1918, and told him basically from 2 weeks from then to go to Washington, D.C. in order to basically testify in front of Congress, and with the Overman Committee that was set up to basically investigate people. So Reed and Bryant and others also had would testify in front of them. So it's kind of a curious path out, but for him personally, it was devastating because he lost all of his material and he lost the draft of this book. So instead of writing the book he couldn't write any longer, theoretically, he wrote this biography of Lenin, and then he got his papers back, and then he wrote the Through the Russian Revolution book. But he wrote that 2 years after John Reed's book came out, which of course created the buzz over the Russian Revolution by 1921 had already sort of faded in many ways. And so this was unfortunate for him in a personal sort of way. Like Bryant and Reed, he would go around, and for the rest of his life, from 1920 till late in his life, until he became ill late in his life, he would speak endlessly. In his papers, I found thousands and thousands of placards about him, speaking here and speaking there, witness to the revolution, support of the revolution, trying to explain the revolution, these sort of things. His first real cause after he came back, in the brief time he's back in 1918 to 21, was he was trying to push for, along with Raymond Robbins, for recognition by the United States, for diplomatic recognition. This was their main cause, trying to get first the Wilson administration, then later administrations to recognize the Soviet Union, which of course did not happen, as we know, until the 1930s. He then decides that this is not really working very well for him, and so in 1922 he decides to go back to the Soviet Union, now the Soviet Union, and he will live there for 6 years. This is the murkiest period of time in his life. I've traced him bits and pieces, but overall I'm not sure exactly where he was at every moment in there. He does get married while he was in Russia to an American. A woman named Lucida Squire is her name. She was part of a Quaker film group who were filming The Famine. And so they met there, and she worked in film off and on the rest of her life. And part of the way they supported themselves while they're in the Soviet Union was she would leave during the 1920s and go to London and work on film projects, and then come back into the Soviet Union. They had that was Raymond Robbins and Lucida Squire. I'll come back to that in a second. So it's during this time, though, that I think that, and he wrote a book about this experience, but it's a very, a book called The Russians, or a book called The Russian Land, that's what it's called, published in the later part of the 1920s. And it's in this book that you see he really became enamored with what was going on. He was in the countryside. He would write about this perhaps naively, this sort of native peasant culture now being explored in the new Soviet system. He really is caught up in this. He really believes that this is going to be the future for the world, and he gets caught up in, especially living so much of that time outside of Moscow or Leningrad, I guess by this point, that it's overwhelming him. This is really what defines his life in many ways. During this time, during the revolutionary period and afterwards, he actually becomes friends with Mikhail Kalinin and receives letters from him all the way into the end of Kalinin's life. And Kalinin actually will be key for him for his return to Russia in 1930, 31, also 1937, and again in not 59, but 31 and 37. He returns to Russia briefly. I'll tell you about those in a second. Their home base during this time was a village called Khvalynsk, which is in the Saratov Oblast, and it's a very small village, still is today. It's a very small place, but this is sort of where they set up home base. And when you go into his papers at Columbia, there are probably 500 photographs like this that he took. The best set of them are not about Russia at all. There are probably 150 glass negatives of color pictures of World War I. In a box, in a wooden box like this. One is broken. I didn't break it. Okay. I didn't break it. I couldn't believe what I pulled out. And some of these pictures were used in his first book, the German Eagle book, but some of them were not. And so that's still something I have to work with, see if I can find a way to have those come to life, because they're sitting in a box in New York. Nonetheless, so these are some. So what you see here are some of his pictures that I took photographs of from his collection. So this is a celebration of the revolution on the 5-year anniversary outside of obviously the Kremlin. He took that was in his collection. By the way, none of this is cataloged, and some of it's marked, but some of it's not. This is one of the homes they lived in, in Khvalynsk. They only lived there about a year, I think, in that home, but they took that there. This is a very unusual picture that also fits the 1920 time period, because Williams is on the left. The non-costume person on the right is Big Bill Haywood, the American labor leader who fled to the Soviet Union in the World War I period. He lived the rest of his life there and died there in 1928. I haven't figured out an explanation of this photograph quite yet, what the rest of the costuming means for them and why they were in this picture. But this is one of the photographs I found in his box of stuff, which was quite interesting. They decided in 1928 to leave, come back to the United States. He just published the Russian Land Book. And the following year, they had their only child, whose name was also Rhys Williams, which again is confusing. And that's he with his son. So in the 1930s, they moved now for several different places. He lived in Canada and the United States off and on for the rest of his life. By the 1930s, he was seen to be, again, an advocate for recognition, somebody who was going to want the United States to recognize the Soviet Union. And in 1930 and 31, he was part of a trip where he led U.S. senators to the Soviet Union. And two key ones were Wheeler, whose first name escapes me right this second, but Wheeler from Montana, and Barkley, who later is vice president, but a senator at the time from Kentucky. And there is he has a very long description of what they did there and why they were there in his papers, probably about a 75-page document that outlines this. And basically what they were doing, these senators were investigating the issue of recognition, but they looked at Williams as somebody who would take them to and sort of see the real Russia. So much of their time was spent outside of major cities. They went out into the countryside in places that Williams had been and where he was well known, actually people he associated with. And again, for the rest of his life, he would correspond with Barkley and other people about these adventures and about books and things they were writing and these sort of things. During the 1930s, he'll write a very detailed book called The Soviets, and then and then he'll also then return to the Soviet Union in 1937, where he is. The reason he's there is unclear to me at this point still. But this is a photograph in his collection that shows him there with the arrow pointing to him. I was actually on the photograph. I didn't do that. Where he is in the crowd, and this is, according to what I found, this is a trial. This is a trial in 1937 of some engineers, where he was present. And he writes about this, and his view of it is that these were sort of necessary things for the revolution. Williams himself never joins the Communist Party of the United States or the Soviet Union. He's offered memberships in both associations. He always refers to himself as a socialist, and he always says that he supported the Soviet system, despite its flaws. He writes that all the time, the word flaws, which I think is underplaying maybe the problem, right? But he is quite prominently there, and he is sort of put out as a very prominent pro-Soviet American. He's used by the Soviets in many ways as a poster child for this sort of activity. The people he associated with thought very highly of him, but also of people like Bessie Beatty and Louise Bryant and John Reed. They really sort of idolized that group of journalists who reported so favorably about the revolution. But as we know, John Reed died in 1920. Louise Bryant drifts away from Russian affairs and eventually dies fairly young, I think in the 1930s as well. And Bessie Beatty, her only adventure in Russia was this one adventure, and then she went on and had a radio and even early television life in California. She was sort of an accidental journalist. She happened to be there, but she had no real Russian interest outside of that one experience. So Williams is the guy. So Williams is the guy that's going to do this, and he continued to do this. So one of the questions that arises about him all the time at this point, especially in the 1930s, at a show trial, is he dumb? Does he know what he's watching? Does he get it? Is he that bought into the system? And the answer is he writes later about. And this is why his papers have proven so valuable, because you can't find it in his books. Later in his papers, when he's writing sort of autobiographical bits and pieces, he writes about how he realized the entire time that the Soviet system was getting worse and worse. And for a time under Stalin, he was kind of a non-person. They didn't really like him anymore, pretty much after this sort of last visit. But he thought he had to defend it because the concept was good, and he had to counter and balance out all of the negative press that was being said about the Soviet system. So he wanted to be that countering voice. People around him questioned him and said, yes, but you're wrong. But you've made a mistake. And they said, well, he didn't agree with that necessarily. He didn't agree with that was the case, and he said, you need to have a counter voice because there are positive aspects to the Soviet system. It seems a little thin to me too. So if that's what you're thinking, it seems a little thin. But he was clearly one of these, somebody who defended it for his entire life. There's an episode here in his life, late in this period of time. He leaves the Soviet Union, but he does not go back to North America. He goes actually to Spain in 1938 on his way home, and he gets involved in the Spanish Civil War. And there's almost no documentation on this except he wrote a manuscript about it. I can't figure out if the manuscript is a book or an article because I haven't found it. It's called After the Bombs Fell. It's mentioned several times in letters to publishers in his papers, but the manuscript itself was not there. So I'm still looking for this. It was described by one publisher who rejected it as being too gory, too violent, the way he described what happened. So I'm still looking for that. Hopefully I can find it someday. I don't think I will, but I can hopefully. When World War II began, he was in demand again because he is a few people who had sort of in-depth Russian knowledge. And so he writes another book called The Soviets. Called The Russians. The book in the 30s was called The Soviets. These are both very in-depth books that are really sort of almost like surveys of religion and politics and life and these sort of things. Not terribly interesting to read, honestly. They're very dense and a lot of sort of statistical information. But he was interviewed and he gave many speeches during World War II about our new ally and our friend and all these sort of things about the Soviet Union. By the 1950s, his health is ailing. In late Stalin's period, he was not somebody that was highly regarded by the Soviet system at the time. He writes about how he feels excluded. He had defended the system his whole life. But late in Stalin's reign, people sort of ignored him and sort of passed him over. And then at the end of his life, he has this sort of return. And that is, after the 1957 Sputnik launch, he writes a very nice article about it in 1950. I think it was published early 58, but anyway, about the launch and about the great success of the Soviet system and how they have achieved all these sort of great monumental things. And they pick up on it in the Soviet Union. And so he is invited back for this grand sort of end-of-life tour, because he dies a couple years later. He was already suffering from leukemia at the time. And he gets to basically tour around Russia with his son, and his daughter-in-law, who I'm in communication with, was on that trip, and his wife. And he also got some special treatment at a couple of centers there for leukemia. And it was sort of, he writes in the last years of his life, the highlight of his life to be sort of returned to the place where it all had begun. So he dies in February of 1962, working on several projects. One was a biographical project, as I mentioned before, with this American author named Joshua Kunitz, who also has papers at Columbia that I looked at, and there wasn't much more in there about where that was all going or why it didn't succeed in really be published. There's a long manuscript that's sort of, I know why. It's a long manuscript that doesn't really go anywhere. So that's why I read the whole thing, and now I know why. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to criticize someone else, but anyway. He also was working on another project, and that was basically a revision, or what he calls sort of the real book of the Russian Revolution he didn't write. So if you go back to the beginning of my story, when he left the revolutionary Russia in 1918, he lost all of his papers. And so he wrote this book, and the book Through the Russian Revolution, published in 1921, is it's interesting, but it's kind of general, and it's kind of flowery in a certain way. It doesn't give you a lot of depth. Well, he was putting together in his last years of his life, and it was completed by his wife and another editor, a book called Journey into the Russian Revolution. And this is a much more in-depth, detailed book of the Russian Revolution that was published in 1969. It's about 7 years after his death. It took a while to get it all together. And that's the book of his that's most often cited by lots of people about real details on the ground of the Russian Revolution. And so I contacted one of the biographers of John Reed, Robert Rosenstone, who wrote a book almost 40 years ago. I contacted him, asking him how much he knew about Williams, and he didn't have much to offer. But he said that Williams's book, this book in particular, Journey into the Russian Revolution, served as a huge source for him because it is detailed and it is almost sort of day by day, week by week sort of events. And that's not what the first book is really like. This one, though, is very, very dense and very long. So it takes a while to get through it. After he died, so this is where he ends up by obviously his death in the 1960s. And then when I put together in the 1970s, his wife will basically organize his papers, or really not organize them, but basically take aspects of them with a couple of other helpers. Actually, a Russian historian will be one of the research assistants, somebody, Albert Rhys, who taught at Northern Illinois University for a long time. He'll be actually a research assistant back in the 1950s, helping them put the papers together. And I live near there, and I contacted him, and he helped me a little bit with putting some things together. So you have these donation of this material in the 1970s to the Lenin Library, and his wife Lucida goes over to the Soviet Union in the 70s for a big celebration of Williams's life, and then Lucida dies in the early 1980s, and then these papers are donated to Columbia probably in the early 1990s by the orchestrations of a longtime friend in the United States of Corliss Lamont, who was a longtime advocate of socialism. And then, so that's how they get there. That's how they get to Columbia eventually. In the end, if you ask yourself the question, who is Albert Rhys Williams? Albert Rhys Williams was a true believer in some ways. This is his visit in 1959 with his wife. I believe that's his wife and his son who was with him on the trip in the photograph there. But in the end, his unapologetic defense of it seems sort of simplistic in a way, but it was something, though, that he felt all the way down to his death in 1962 was a critical and essential part of his experience, I think, from 1917. He was so in love with what had happened, and then his experience in the 1920s. And I don't think, from my reading of his later work and his later even fragmentary manuscript writings, he never could get that image out of his head of what life was like then, despite what we know happened later on. So that's Albert Rhys Williams. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to see if I can answer them. Yes.
Yeah, what was your experience at the manuscript division in Lennon Library? Any problems with cooperation or anything there?
I did it in two ways. I actually have a friend who lives in Moscow who I hired a researcher through. I have an American friend who hired a Russian researcher, and she started it for me. So when I was there using them, it was only selected things. So we'd already sort of picked them out. And so being that directed, it wasn't too difficult at the time. I think if I walked in there and said, let me see your stuff on Williams, then it would have been much more complicated. But I'd already been through a list that she had made for me. This person had made a list of the items, and that's what I wanted to look at. So it was okay. It was fine. But I was only there a brief time. It was sort of it was just a few days to look at a few items because I was there on another trip for another reason. So it wasn't extensive, but I was trying to get a sense of if I'm missing a whole lot by not digging deeply into those. But by the list I have, it's remarkably similar to what I found in Columbia. So yes.
Do you have any suspicions that perhaps he was on the Kremlin's payroll in some way, shape, or form?
That's one of the suspicions that he had his entire life. He was investigated by House Un-American Activities Committee and these sort of things. I found no evidence of that. Found no evidence that he ever was a spy, that he was informing them in any way.
Even to spread the good news, I mean, they could, whatever.
Right.
His way there and back, give him whatever.
I think his trip in 1922, I know he paid for himself because I know he talked in his writing talked about not having any money, and that's why his wife had to keep leaving. His new wife had to keep leaving to go work and basically support the cause, support the enterprise. The 1930-31 trip I was paid for by the U.S. government, was paid because the senators went on it. The 1937 trip was paid for, I believe, by the Soviets. So there was some suspicion there because this is through his friendship with Mikhail Kalinin, longtime friendship. There's several photographs of Kalinin in his collection and of photographs, and so there seems to be a long-time connection to Kalinin in that. But I found no hard evidence. I've been trying to investigate with. Well, it's the Navy now, the Navy archives to see what happened, the path of his papers, where they went, and they're being very reluctant to give me anything.
But on the Russian side, you can't get anything out of.
I can't. Not so far. I haven't found anything so far. I gave a paper on him last year at the what used to be called the AASS, but anyway, the Slavic Studies Conference, and there was a colleague of ours who was born and raised in the Soviet Union on the panel, and he's Ukrainian, but he was born and raised in the Soviet Union, and he, at the end of my paper, he commented, he said, "Why are you working on Williams at all?" And I said, well, I didn't expect that question, actually. I said, I don't know, I just wasted 2 years, I don't know what I'm doing. Anyway, I said, he's an unusual figure, and I said, he's one of these people, I'm kind of like Marguerite Harrison, the book you're passing around, and Pavel Svinin, who's not in the forefront. He's not John Reed, right? And so he's somebody else, though, who had a lifelong association with the Soviet Union, and that really has not been studied, I mean, in a serious way, at least in English. And he said, he kind of threw up his hands and looked at me and said, "We know all about him." And I said, "Well, you know all about him because they kept republishing his stuff inside the Soviet Union." I said, "But Americans have never heard of him." I mean, everyone I talk to, except for people like you, I mean, but people have never heard of this person. And I think there's something worthwhile studying. I don't know if hopefully it's a whole book, but who knows what it will be in the end. But it's something worthwhile in his perspective. I find him to be sort of simultaneously three things, sort of frustrating in a way because he sort of takes this simplistic approach to the Soviet Union, which I wish he didn't. So I kind of wish he wasn't. I wish he had a more nuanced sort of view, in a certain way. But he's also, though, somebody who's seemed quite dedicated, which I'm not sure if I can really pinpoint exactly where it comes from, other than the connection between his early life, where he got involved in sort of radical or socialist politics before the Soviet experience, and that connects over to this. He sees this as the answer to the inequality he experienced. I think that's where he drove the rest of his life, which makes it unfortunate because then the rest of his life is not very critical. He's not being very critical of what he's seeing, it seems. So,
What
yeah.
about his look at American society?
I mean, in a sense, the devs is understandable.
Right.
Okay, that
Yep.
makes a great deal of sense.
Yep.
But now he's coming back to the United States. He's there at least at the beginning of the Harding years. He's
Yeah.
out for the Roaring '20s.
Mm-hmm.
He's coming back in 1928, which is a lousy year to come back.
Right.
I mean, things aren't going to look,
Right.
if you're a socialist looking at the United States, you're not,
Right.
you know,
Right, and he has a son, and he was a bit older by the time his son was born, and he has a son born in 1929. And one of the things I have trouble with him is tracking down what he did for a living. He lived in Cedar, Vancouver, British Columbia, Cedar, British Columbia, a small town. He lived some of his time in Carmel, California, and he also lived some of his time in New York. Can't remember the name of the town. Anyway, but in New York.
on the Hudson, up there.
Yeah, up the Hudson. I can't remember the name of the town. So I think he, I think he's critical of the United States. He sees basically capitalism, the American style capitalism, as being exploitive and basically the root of the inequality in America. And he goes back to his ministerial days of worrying about poverty and working with people to get places to live and these sort of things he did as a minister. So he doesn't ever really leave the ministry in that sort of sense. I think it just shifted for him from being this religious calling to being more of a political calling in some ways. And he seems very devoted in that sort of way. And he sort of has convinced himself that, and I think maybe coming back in 1928 and having a son born in 29 creates this reality for him that this is the answer to our economic problems. It's clearly not capitalism, it's socialism. And so I think that reinforces that to him to some degree. Yeah, so the thing I have a hard time tracking down though is what he did for a living. I have some archival material from Marietta College that were alumni sort of things that people sent in. So he filled them out. His handwriting's terrible. You can tell it's his handwriting. And he would put down, writer for Harcourt. Well, one of his books was published by Harcourt, Brace and Jovanovich back in those days. And so, but he wrote 7 books over 35 years. So can you live off that? I don't live off that. I mean, is he ready? Is he publishing enough? So I looked into the publishing runs of these books and how much they were sold, and they sold pretty well. But I'm still thinking he sort of lived this life of sort of spotty employment for much of his life. I don't get the impression he had sort of a constant job other than writing.
What about the wife?
She kept going. She kept working in movies well into the 30s, but then it sort of fades after that. We don't see much more evidence of that after that. So.
You mentioned
Yep.
then placards about speeches and stuff.
Absolutely.
He
Well, he
collected money from that.
He did, and there were a lot of them, and I imagine what were in those boxes were not all of them. Certainly, it was just a sampling of them. But he gave many speeches, dozens and dozens. I mean, it was a lot in certain periods of his life. I mean, it wasn't constant. But again, that's just a sampling, and I don't know if there were other. How many he gave, but he traveled for them and he corresponded. I mean, he seemed to have some association with sort of people like Upton Sinclair. For the rest of his life, he has a letter writing sort of communication with him that you see periodically later in his life. So he's associating with this sort of crowd of people. But as far as what he does for a living,
You mentioned the Soviet info service there in
Yep.
New York. Did he get paid for that? Was that
it never started.
Oh, it never started.
It never started because he was basically being commissioned to do this by Lenin, sort of indirectly, but by Lenin in essence, in the spring of 1918. So he was still there. Reed and Bryant and Beatty had all left. And he lingered around in the spring of that year. And when he went back to the United States in the fall of 1918, he testifies in front of the Overman Committee. And they accuse him of being a spy. They accuse him of doing, promoting propaganda, this red propaganda, all that stuff. And it never gets off the ground. So, but it would have been a paid position, yes, because there was money talked about, yeah.
There are a lot of things that are very informative but also intriguing about your talk. I'll throw out 1 or 2 of them if you don't mind.
Sure.
One, you referred to the difference between his publication, what he said about Soviet Russia, his publications, and what he said about it in his papers.
Yes.
So that's my first question, is it how significant and in what form does this difference manifest itself?
When I look at Williams, there are three kinds of writing he has. One is the books he published. The second one are things he wrote in different kinds of magazines and journals at the time. Soviet Russia Today. He wrote early on for one or two things for the masses, but also a journal called Asia, several in the Revolutionary period. A lot of those articles from those periodical publications ended up in his books. So there's not a lot of difference between those two. But what I found in his papers, which I was happy to find, is that he's more reflective. He's more reflective about the Soviet system. So the Soviet system comes off very well in all of his books. If you read all of his books, it comes off very, very well, and the problems are few, and sort of things. In his papers, especially as they get later, if I can date them, which I usually can, he becomes more and more reflective, and it's a kind of disappointment that the revolution did not go the way he thought it should go, which may not be that different of a reflection from other people. That he was more intrigued by the Lenin world than the Stalin world in his sort of look at it. So, yeah, sure.
I was moved by this picture of him in the room among these audience members during the trials of the wreckers, the engineers. Did you have any evidence that he was aware of the fact that quite a few Americans who were socialists or communists in the United States immigrated to Soviet Russia in the 1930s? Whether he was aware of that, or whether he mentions it anywhere.
I've not found a mention of it yet.
Okay. That's part of this question is more bringing what you're talking about up to date, which applies to most of the people sitting at this table even. When I talk about Pushkin to a general audience, I don't have to think about this at all. But when I talk to the Rotary Club at Lawrence, Kansas about Russia in 2015, I'm trying to be as objective and informative as possible. And at the same time, either before or during this talk or afterwards, especially when I hear the kinds of questions that are raised, then this question comes up as to whether I am a Russia basher or whether I am a apologist for Russia. It sounds to me like even this gentleman even was affected by that. So do you think that there's a larger implication, which you would not necessarily describe, I suppose, in a book which is a historical character, about this aspect of Americans in Russia during the 20th century, during the Soviet period, let's say? If you agree with me that is a huge problem which comes to our consciousness quite often when we're talking about Russia.
Right. I think absolutely. I think that could be one of the keys to all this is that he puts on sort of a different hat for different purposes and different audiences. I think absolutely. Some years ago, I was on a Fulbright in Russia, and I was teaching a class of students, and the student asked me, it was about American culture, and they said, "So what do Americans think about a religion?"
You got a few hours?
Well, because your mind races, right? Your mind races. So there's 300 million Americans, and they didn't ask what I thought about religion. They asked what Americans. Well, what they were asking about was that surveys showed that 60% of Americans attend some sort of weekly religious service, and this is different than what you find in. Okay, that's the premise of the question, but I struggled to answer the question because I sat there in front of them thinking, well, here I am as the American representative of the United States, trying to sort of answer this question, and I fumbled around pretty badly apparently because I didn't answer the question very well because I didn't know what to say, because they weren't asking me about my own views, they weren't asking about my family life, my family's history and religion, whatever. So it creates I think you're right, and I think what he was doing was it for public purposes trying to defend what he had taken part in to a great degree, what he had promoted when he was right back from the revolutionary period, 1918, 1920, and then written about quite favorably. And he just never really moved from that position, despite what we know was going on. He just never quite moved in that position. The question of the Americans in the 1930s is a very interesting one, and he has gaps in his own writing. And the 1930s is when he was not terribly prolific about his own. He kept diaries off and on in his life, and there was not one at that period of time. So, yeah, I don't, yeah.
To what extent was Williams influential?
It's a good question. It's a very good question because to Soviets, apparently he was very influential, according to our colleague who sort of looked at me aghast at that last conference. Why study him? We know all about him. Everybody knows about Williams. I think he, in periods of time, he's actually quite influential. I think he is, his books are, when you look at the reviews of his books in the United States, especially Through the Russian Revolution and the Russian Land book he wrote in the 1920s, they're very positively reviewed as some of the most insightful books about Russia and the Common Age, all these sort of things. The later books, the ones, the Soviets in the 30s and the Russians in the 1940s, are less so, ironically, because I think they're too difficult. They're too dense in a way. They're kind of boring, actually, to be honest with you. So I think he's influential in moments in his life. And I think one area is where he was on that tour with the Senators. I think that's actually a key to his influence. When he was on the tour with the Senators in 1930 and 31, probably may have been the peak of his influence. Yeah, but it's a good question because most subjects I get involved with, that's always a question that comes up is sort of the so what question. So why is this person important? And there are a couple of books that are sitting there that kind of represent that too. Sometimes you have to ask yourself the question over and over, why are these people important? And I think he is, he was somebody who was fairly well known up until about World War II. He was somebody well known in the United States as a voice of pro-Soviet views and somebody who was a strong advocate, especially with Raymond Robbins, for recognition. They fought hard for that. So I'm not sure, you know, he didn't at the time, I don't think, nor today, have the general recognition as somebody like John Reed. I can mention John Reed to a fairly broad audience of people, not as broad as I once thought, but anyway, a fairly broad audience of people, and they'll know who he is. Williams, they won't know. So, yeah.
One question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting he went to Spain.
Yes.
Your comments on 1937 remind me of Feuchtwanger.
Oh.
It's exactly the same problem. He
Yes.
goes in 1937
Oh, yes.
and sees
Oh.
the Soviet Union as a wonderful place.
Oh, yeah.
That notion in 1937, I would be very interested in his papers what he says in 1939.
Yeah.
Because there are people who don't like Uncle Joe, who becomes supportive of the Soviet Union once the rise of Hitler happens.
Right.
And particularly when the military problem is becoming the anticipation that there's going to be a larger conflict in Europe.
Right.
And many of fellow travelers here whom we talk about tend to go in that direction of time without any socialist background, much less
Right.
the experience he has. What does he say about 39, the non-aggression pact?
I've not found anything directly about that yet. So, his writings are very scattered. They're not on every subject like I'd like them to be. It'd be much neater if he wrote about every event, so I could get the. I've not found anything about the non-aggression pact yet. So, yeah.
Be interesting.
Yeah.
Very briefly, what did he tell the House Un-American Activities Committee during the McCarthy?
Actually, his that is. He didn't testify in front of the whole committee. He was interviewed. He was interviewed, I think, privately for this. So he never went in front of the whole committee. And they basically just asked him about his associations. And it was the transcript reads a very similar way of, you know, are you a member of the Communist Party, like sort of things. And he answers the questions. He says no. And he's never been. This is a big issue for him because he was offered membership by Lenin himself into the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And then when he came back to the United States, people were putting pressure on him to join the Communist Party of the United States, and he never does either one. And I don't think he even joins the Socialist Party. He always just described himself as a socialist. But he basically just goes and it gives him almost a historical account of when, kind of how I did it with you, just kind of I was there, this is what I did, and what I did. And it didn't go further than an interview with the committee. So there's a transcript of that. The Overman Committee back in 1918 and 1919 was very interesting because they basically were asking him questions about subversives and this trying to penetrate American society and these dangerous people, and he turns all the questions around on the committee. It's a very interesting transcript where he turns the questions around. And he said, I find dangerous people to be people who ask questions about basically dangerous people, and so he turns it back around onto the committee itself. It's quite a masterful way he does this, but basically saying, I find dangerous people to be those people that don't trust their fellow citizens or something. It's really quite an interesting turnaround there. But the Un-American Activities was a brief period. He wasn't, if you think about the early 50s, the later 40s, early 50s when that got moving, he's he's not retired in a sense. I mean, because I'm not sure what he ever did. He's sort of in a period where he's not very active by that period in his life. The post-World War II period to 1962 when he dies, he just wasn't as active. What got him sort of back in the game was this article about the Sputnik launch, and then he went to the Soviet Union again. But by 1957 or 8, I think he had been diagnosed with leukemia, I think, by that point, somewhere in that period. And so his later years are much less activity.
When was he diagnosed roughly?
57, I think.
When did he die?
62.
Yeah.
Right. And so he went, while in the Soviet Union, he got some special treatment that they only describe as special treatment, which I'm not sure what that meant. But he went to a sanatorium and he went to a place. So they offered him that. It was a long trip. They were there for actually several weeks, maybe 8 weeks in 1959. And part of that time he did some speeches, and he was recognized for his contribution to the Soviet system, but then he also had some health care while he was there. I think he was trying a different treatment. So
It's fascinating. This, of course, kind of coincides with the anti-Stalin
yes,
push by the party.
right.
When exactly did the Soviets the Stalinists turn on him? When did he become bad for them, that they didn't want to use him?
From what I see, it's after the 37 visit. So the 37 visit was okay, and I think it was, and I'm certain it was organized by Kalinin to come. But after that, he seemed to drop off. He has a resurgence of importance in the United States in the war, because he not only had written a book in the 30s called The Soviets, but then he writes another book which is actually kind of he lifts a lot of his own stuff into the new book called The Russians. And so this is a book sort of about our new ally kind of idea. And so he has more prominence in America at the time, but he has almost no connection during that time to officials in the Soviet Union. There's some individual people that write him. There's some letters back and forth. But as far as having any sort of official recognition, you don't see that really come again until after the 57, after the article about the Sputnik launch. So he's kind of closed off for maybe almost 20 years in the later part of his life. And so you find some writings. There's some writings where he's upset about this. He feels like he's been excluded. He wrote these in like 1951 and 54 in that period of time when he was getting older, and he just thought, I thought I did so much for them, and now they don't even sort of recognize me or respond to what I've dedicated my life to, these sort of comments. So, but then, like I said, in the last couple of years, it got much better for him because he got to return. So.
No, he was useful to Khrushchev. He's a tie back to Lenin, and that's a very useful thing if you want to legitimize yourself at the expense of the Stalin era.
And in some of the Soviet publications at the time, they talk about that endlessly. All they focus on, of course, is the revolutionary period and sort of the running with Lenin era, when he ran with Lenin. And so that's what they focus on entirely, is that he was there to pass out leaflets, and and they did. I mean, he actually threw leaflets from backs of trucks and stuff in Petrograd, and so he writes about that quite explicitly in many different ways, and talks about this in a very, very favorable way. And that's what the Soviets always focused on as well, is that he was there in the beginning, and so which gives him
In 1930, he led an American congressional delegation to Russia.
It was a congressional delegation that was going to, I guess, investigate the idea of recognition. And they brought him.
He was the leader, though.
He was the sort of the content leader. He was their person who was going to tell them about the American, who was going to tell them all about Russia.
So he was well enough thought of within the United States at that time.
Yes, and well enough thought of by people pushing for recognition. And the person he was following more in the push for recognition, I think, is Raymond Robbins. Because Raymond Robbins, who was the Red Cross director, or head of the Red Cross in Russia during the revolution in 1917. He endlessly pushes for this in the 1920s. This is his cause, and I think Williams follows him, and I think it's through Robbins that he gets this. He didn't like create the commission, but he's the American expert on the ground kind of concept. Yeah, and very frankly, he had spent 6 or 7 years in Russia, and so he was certainly an American who had more in-depth knowledge of the country than most others at the time. I mean, quite honestly, there weren't many other people who had that much knowledge probably of Russia. So, I mean, as biased as he might be, one way or the other, but so.
I was just thinking about Wheeler. Is it Burton K. Wheeler?
Yes, it's Burton Wheeler. Sorry, thank you. He was very influential, the senator from Montana. He was very influential at the time.
This is the isolation,
Yes.
there's a whole long.
Right, there's a long story behind this. The Senate, and the ones that went, there was a third one as well, but Wheeler and Barclay from Kentucky are the key ones. And he doesn't have much correspondence with Wheeler after that, but he does with Barclay well into the 1950s about their trip there and their experience. And so, yeah, he was
Of the United States.
eventually, yes, he was vice president of the United States, right? And so he still wielded. I mean, he has letters from Barclay when Barclay was vice president later on. Yeah, and they talk very favorably about, not so much about the Soviet Union at that time, but about the trip and how it was very, nice sort of thing.
We're out of time. I want to thank you all for coming.